right. Da-da-da-da-da. We are live. Where am I going here now? All right, Mr. Bill, thank you.
All right, here we go. Seems like forever since we've been together, partly because of Easter, and then I was sick Sunday before that, I believe. So here we are back in the life of Christ. Exciting adventure and looking at the life of Christ from a chronological harmony of the Gospels. So before we begin our study tonight, let's ask God's blessing on our time. Father, we thank you that we have so much information about our Lord and Savior. He is the center of our affections, of our lives, and the more we can know about him, the more we like it. And so we're blessed to have these four Gospels to draw upon, as well as sources outside of the Bible that give us insight into the culture and historical background. And we're blessed in that way. We have so much more than any other people in history. So we pray that we would make good use of that tonight. Direct us in our thinking. We appreciate what you have done in history and the bringing of our Savior to this world. We ask that you be glorified through that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are on page 28 of your workbook, page 28 in the workbook, ready to start section 14, which is in your harmony on page 34. Page 34 in your harmony. All right, so this is the in your harmony, it says wise men seek the king. In your workbook, I just entitled it In Bethlehem. Kind of generic, doesn't tell you much. But we're going to be looking at a lot of things related to the historical situation of the time of the Magi. And first of all, we're going to find out who King Herod was, how he came to be there, and then we'll be looking at who the Magi were and how they came to be there. So kind of exciting stuff in my mind anyway. Hopefully you will find it exciting also. All right, so as we look at the first question there, number 97, it says to research or remember who was this king in Jerusalem. Oh, we should read the text first. I neglected to do that. So let's read the section 14 text, which is Matthew 2, 1 through 12. Would one of you like to read that for us? Sam's got it. Remember, everybody, when you're speaking, speak loudly and clearly so that the microphone will pick you up. My mother said she'd be watching tonight. Hi, Mom. And so we want to make sure she can hear what you're saying. Go ahead, Sam.
Days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star and its rising and have come to worship him."
By the way, some of the translations say in the east, and it can be translated that way, but probably what it means is when it was rising, that the word the east can have that connotation as well. Go ahead.
All Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. Bethlehem of Judea told them, because this is what was written by the prophets. You, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. We go on?
Yeah.
Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time and that the star would appear. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him." After hearing the king, they went on their way. There it was, the star they had seen rising, that led them until the kingdom stopped on the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. Falling to their knees, they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route.
All right, boy, and there's a lot there in those verses. Matthew's the only one that describes this particular aspect of the birth of Jesus, or soon after the birth of Jesus. So we want to look into some of the context here. So the first question is, who was this king in Jerusalem? Anybody know? He's called King Herod here, but there are other people called Herod in the New Testament as well. Anybody know what this particular king is called, what his name is? Herod the Great. Yeah, Herod the Great. Didn't have a last name, but he's simply called Herod the Great to distinguish him from son and grandson, who are also named Herod. In fact, Herod is if you look at the family tree, you find Herod all over the place, including some of the females called Herodias. All right, so who was this King Herod? Let's look at number 98. Who knows, was he a descendant of David? Was Herod the Great a descendant of David? Which he should be if you're going to be the king of Israel, right? Was he a descendant of David? No. So you can just write a nice no there. Well, if not, then from where did he come? Well, we're going to answer that in a few minutes. So you won't be able to fill anything there yet. Number 99, research or remember. How did he become king? Well, we're going to go through that as well. I didn't expect you to look all that up and to figure that out. All right, so we're going to do that now. Now I'm going to give you the background to Herod and the Magi. And to do so, and I really didn't leave room for you to take notes there. So if you want to take notes, you might have to find some, maybe on the bottom of the page, there's extra space there, or just not bother and just enjoy as much as you can. All right, so in order to understand who Herod is and where he came from, and the Magi, we have to go back in time to the time period of Alexander the Great. Remember Alexander the Great? That'll give us an understanding of the events surrounding this coming of the Magi. By 323 BC, Alexander had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to Asia Minor and all the way to India. You see there in the green. And so he conquered the known world at that time. He didn't all except, we could say, to the east, to Rome, but most of the civilized world he conquered in his 20s. As he was returning from India, when he got to the Indus River in India, his soldiers basically said, we've had enough. We're so far from home. We've been doing this for years. And he wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. And so he turned around and was going to go back and consolidate all that he had conquered, set up government and so on in those places. And as he was returning to consolidate his holdings, a fever gripped him in Babylon. He was going to rebuild Babylon, but he got this fever and died. There's a lot of speculation as to what exactly killed Alexander the Great, and we're probably not going to go into that too much. He was only 33 years old, and so no preparation had been made for succession. Some favored recognizing Alexander's young illegitimate son as heir of the kingdom, but most realized that he was not ready for such a task, nor was Alexander's yet unborn son. One of his wives was pregnant. So it was decided to divide the empire eventually into 4 sects, each one headed by one of Alexander's 4 generals. Now, this verse that pops up here on this slide is from Daniel 11, because much of what occurs from this point, from the time of Alexander the Great until partway through the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and New Testament, a large part of that was foretold by Daniel in Daniel chapter 11. And when we were going through ancient times here a few years ago, I went through Daniel 11 and showed how what was spoken there, what exactly happened. Gave the details of all that. And unfortunately, I didn't see that I didn't see any of ancient times on our church's YouTube. I don't know what's happened with all of those. It started New Testament times, or anything earlier than that. If we can't find that, that's lost forever. That was going to be the next thing I was going to do on discovering his story when we had to stop. So anyway, maybe if we can't find it sometime, I'll do it again. And I have put that in print, by the way. The only place I've seen it, I don't know of any place else that has a correlation between Daniel 11 and then the historical events that happened. But anyway, so that's what pops up here is the verses that were fulfilled by what Alexander the Great did. Well, getting back to the story. So they divided the kingdom into 4 sections under each of Alexander's 4 generals. Egypt was to be under the control of General Ptolemy. You see his name there over Egypt. And Syria. He also would have Syria, which is the purple part that goes up past what we think of as Israel. North of Israel is Syria. So Ptolemy controlled that. Includes what came to be called Palestine or the Levant. Syria originally was under General Seleucus, which is even further north there, I guess, in the orange, Seleucus. And these 2, along with their descendants, remained rivals. The other 2 generals kind of bowed out. Their descendants kind of eventually were overtaken by these 2. These are the 2 main ones, Seleucus and Ptolemy. And so they, along with their descendants, remained rivals until they were finally disposed of by the Roman Empire. The area including Israel. So there's how it eventually panned out, the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. The area including Israel was a coveted trophy to each of these families, with each of them periodically gaining ascendancy there. So you can see the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom kind of meet together in the area where Israel is located. And so there was always fighting back and forth there. One family would take over, then the other family would take over. I won't go into all the details there, which is quite interesting in itself, and follows Daniel 11 exactly. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria, which was founded by Alexander, and then he named it after himself, which he did quite often. There are a lot of cities named Alexandria throughout his empire, but this became the most famous, and he founded it in order to make it a rival to Athens. He wanted it to be just as important as Athens. And it did, in fact, become one of the leading cities of the ancient world, and produced, and there it is, there's Alexandria. It produced the renowned Library of Alexandria. There's a drawing of what it may have looked like. All those scrolls, don't have books yet. And from that library, Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry in 300 BC. It was in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth and was only, I think, a few hundred miles off, something like that. If Columbus had read Eratosthenes or believed him, he never would have set sail. because Columbus thought the Earth was a lot smaller than it actually is. So in fact, he thought it was 3,000 miles shorter across from Europe to Asia than it actually is. And that 3,000 miles would have meant that he never would have come back if he hadn't hit the Americas. But this guy calculated it just from math, calculated circumference of the Earth. Also from Alexandria, Herophilus determined that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence. And Hero of Alexandria actually invented the steam engine. It's in ancient times. Also in Alexandria, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos Lighthouse, was built and functioned to guide ships into the harbor of Alexandria. It is no longer there. I think it was an earthquake that did in the lighthouse. And probably the most important thing for those of us that are Bible scholars is that was in Alexandria, the Septuagint was brought into existence. The Septuagint, indicated by the LXX, or Roman numerals. Anybody remember your Roman numerals? What is LXX? 70. And it was given that abbreviation for the Septuagint because it was said that 70 scholars worked on translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And there's lots of speculation about all of that, different traditions and so on. But the Septuagint is a very important work and helps to inform us of many parts of the Old Testament. So what is the Septuagint? We can see it's a collection of ancient Jewish scriptures, but in Greek and larger than the Hebrew Bible, HB Hebrew Bible. The Greek translation is plus additional books not in Hebrew Bible called deuterocanonical or apocryphal books. There are various editions of the Septuagint, as you can see there, and the abbreviation was first translated and compiled around 250 BC and used by Greek-speaking Jews living outside of Israel. And I would add to that, and living inside of Israel. The Septuagint was the Old Testament used by most of the Jews in the time of Jesus and by most of the Christians who came into the church at the time of Jesus. And there's a great reason for that. Not only because people already had begun to forget Hebrew, the common language at the time of Jesus was Aramaic, which is a kind of a blend of Hebrew and some other languages in the area. But most people didn't speak Hebrew or read Hebrew. They spoke and wrote Greek because Greek was the language of trade. Greek was the language of the academy. Greek was the language spoken by everyone, and that goes back to Alexander the Great as well. But there's another reason why the Septuagint became readily available and used by so many people at the time of Jesus, and that is it was cheaper. It was a lot cheaper. You could buy copies of the Septuagint. You really couldn't buy copies of the Hebrew manuscripts. So Septuagint becomes very important. In fact, there's some scholars who would point out that there are some sections of the Old Testament that are more reliable from the Septuagint than maybe from some of our Hebrew texts, but we won't get into all that. It's the first translation of any part of the Bible. You can see it's translated into Koine Greek. Koine means common Greek. There are different kinds of Greek. There's the aristocratic Greek, and there's Attic. There's all that. But Koine is the common language. You can see when it was done. Some of this is repetitive. Many Old Testament quotations in the New Testament are actually from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew. You can see the differences from the Hebrew Bible. Yes.
Yeah,
If they can at least read,
right.
know how to read it, if they read it out loud, because they would read it, and maybe some of them in Latin as well. Okay, here are the four main divisions of the Septuagint. We have the law, or the Pentateuch. We call it the Pentateuch. Law, history, the poetry and wisdom books, and then the prophetic books. And you'll hear Jesus refer to the law and the prophets. Essentially, that was a way of describing the whole Old Testament. Sometimes it's called the writings. In the Hebrew Bible, there were three divisions. Now, angry about a failure to conquer Ptolemy, Egypt, in AD 167, the Seleucid ruler, whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, marched into Jerusalem with overwhelming forces and conducted a massacre in which 80,000 men, women, and children were put to the sword. This we find in 2 Maccabees chapter 5. Now, there's a lot of background to this. It goes back to even to Antiochus I, Antiochus IV's great-great-grandfather, who was called Antiochus the Great. And he conquered a large area, and it's after him, actually, that the two towns we find in the New Testament called Antioch are named after Antiochus the Great. He was defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia. So his milk of Magnesia was not a pleasant experience. But anyway, get it. But that's a century before. So we get to Antiochus IV, and his desire was to make the area of Israel more Greek. It's called Hellenization, and he'd been trying to do that. He also wanted to conquer Egypt, and there's a lot of it's like a soap opera, the stuff that happened between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, which I'm not getting into here. But he was initially defeated Ptolemy VI, but he, on another attempt to conquer more, he was rebuffed by Rome. Actually stepped in, and so on his way back home, he stopped off in Jerusalem and took out his anger on them. He profaned the temple and robbed it of its golden vessels and other sacred objects valued at 1,800 talents. Not only did Antiochus enthrone himself for adoration by the Jews as he sat in the court of the desecrated Jerusalem temple in 168 BC, but he also claimed divine honors for himself on every major coin that he minted. You see a coin there in the bottom right. He vented his fury against the Holy Covenant, as it is termed in Daniel 11:32. I'm sorry, 11:28, and the entire Mosaic system, favoring any renegade Jews who turned to help him in Daniel 11:32. He desecrated the temple and abolished, the daily sacrifice. According to what we find in Daniel 8, he is the little horn. If you remember anything about that prophecy, there are four horns. Those are the four generals of Alexander the Great, and then he is the little horn that was going to cause a lot of problems. That is Antiochus IV. He sent his general Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers into Jerusalem on what was purported to be a peace mission. The date of this desecration and pillage of Jerusalem was the 16th of December in 168. a day of special significance in view of the fact that exactly 3 years later, the patriot leader, Judas Maccabeus, rededicated the temple to the worship of Yahweh, having cleansed it from all of its pagan defilements. And we'll talk about how that came about. This then was the fulfillment of the prediction of Daniel 11:28 regarding Antiochus's action taken against the Holy Covenant. This verse actually sums up as a single process the whole series of measures taken by Antiochus in subduing and suppressing the religious liberties of Judah from 172 to 168 BC. In seeking to exterminate Judaism and to Hellenize the Jews, he forbade the Jews to follow their religious practices, including their festivals and circumcision, and commanded that copies of the law be burned. He wanted all to worship him, calling himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes meaning the illustrious one, or the one who is the manifest one. From his coins, we know that he linked up this Epiphanes with the added title Theos, which is the Greek for God. Thus, the two in combination meant the illustrious God, or God manifest. However, the Jews turned Epiphanes into another name, nicknamed him Epimanes, which means madman. In his culminating act, and by the way, his laws for not circumcising, not having copies of the Torah, all those things were punishable by death. If a woman was found with a circumcised baby, they would hang the baby around her neck and throw her over a wall. It just killed anybody who practiced Judaism. In the culminating act, he erected on December 16th, 167 BC, an altar to Zeus, or Jupiter, on the altar of burnt offering outside the temple. Interestingly, the face of this statue of Zeus was his own face. And then he had a pig offered on the altar. We saw that prophesied in Daniel 11:31. He then forced the priests to swallow the flesh of the pig, which would make them ceremonially unclean to ever do anything in the temple. He also made a broth of the pig and sprinkled the juice of the pig all over the entire temple, thereby defiling the entire structure. Antiochus sprinkled the pig blood in the Holy of Holies and poured its broth over the holy scrolls before cutting them to pieces and burning them. All this was termed by the horrified Jews as the abomination of desolation, and is referred to by Jesus in Matthew 24:15 as a springboard to describe the activities of the future Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes finally carried off the golden candlesticks, the table of showbread, altar of incense, various other vessels, and destroyed the sacred books of the law. The Jews thereafter were compelled to offer a pig on the 25th of each month to celebrate Antiochus Epiphanes' birthday. All throughout Israel, altars to Jupiter or Zeus were set up, and Jews were forced to sacrifice on them, especially if they found any priests living in that area. They would force the priests to sacrifice pigs on these altars. Any Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus's false religious system were persecuted and martyred for their faith. Jewish practices such as Sabbath, festivals, sacrifices, circumcision, teaching of Torah were prohibited. And if any of those activities were observed, the entire family was put to death. Copies of Torah were confiscated and burned at monthly inspections. However, the Jews are resilient people. And they were not going to give up easily teaching Torah or the law to their children. So they came up with an ingenious plan. They decided that the best way to hide something was to hide in plain sight. You ever heard of that before? So what they did is they would gather the children around, sitting on the ground in the open street, and the priest would have the Torah and would be teaching Torah there in plain sight. And if they saw any of the soldiers of Antiochus coming, he would hide the Torah under his garment and get out what's called a dreidel or dreidel. I forget which is the proper way to say that. Beth could tell me. And pretended to be playing a children's game. And that's where that originates. The spinning of the dreidel. It has a letter on each side, a Hebrew letter, which came in from what happened later. But here's how the game would be played. If you landed with the gimel side up, then you would take all of what was put in the pot, whether it's candy or if you want to use pennies or whatever. If the noon comes up, you get nothing, and everybody puts something else into the pot. If you have a hay come up, you take half of what's in the pot. And if you come up with a sheen, you have to put one in yourself. So that's the game. And it's still played today during celebration of what holiday, do you know? We'll find out a little bit later. So while all this is going on, in a little Jewish town called Modin, about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, there lived a Jewish priest named Mattathias of the house of Hasmon. Hasmon was their last name, who had 5 sons. This priest had been selected in 166 BC by the king's religious ambassador, Apelles, to make the offering and to be the first to taste the pig flesh. Mattathias coldly refused the order and stood before Apelles, waiting to be struck down. Suddenly, a man from the village advanced toward the officer, offering to make the sacrifice on behalf of the people there. With that, he took the knife and walked to the altar. A soldier raised the struggling pig and placed it before the man. As he began to raise the knife, an outraged Mattathias leaped on him, wrested the knife from his grasp, and plunged it into the villager. Before the astonished Apelles could react, he too was dealt a death blow. Emboldened by his act, the priest's 5 sons and other men of the town quickly dispatched the remaining soldiers. The Jewish revolt was on. Mattathias and his sons fled into the mountains, from where they conducted guerrilla warfare. We find this indicated in Daniel, prophesied in Daniel 11:33-35. These men would engage in a ministry of education and evangelism, as it were, among their own countrymen, urging them first to get back to God and to pattern their lives according to Scripture. Then they were to answer the call to arms and hazard their very lives for the liberation of their land from the yoke of their God-hating persecutor. The Syrian, as they were called, even though they're Greeks, but because of their control of Syria, they're called Syrians. The Syrian persecution had led to a revolt of what are called the Hasidim. You may be familiar with that term from today. The Hasidim are the most conservative of Jewish people today. They're the ones, if you see them, they have the locks of hair hanging down. Of course, their yarmulke. They wear a prayer shawl all the time. But this revolt, they were involved with this revolt because they revered the Scriptures. And Antiochus Epiphanes was trying to destroy the Scriptures. But they had a problem. They refused to fight on the Sabbath. Well, it didn't take long for Antiochus Epiphanes to figure out that if he attacked these guys on the Sabbath, it would just kill them all and they wouldn't fight. So eventually the Hasidim understood that maybe it was okay to fight on the Sabbath, and so they began to do that. So the word fall in Daniel 11:33 and 34 refers to the severe suffering of the sect of many and the death for others. One of Mattathias's sons was named Judas. You see his 5 sons there. And he picked up a nickname. He was called Maccabeus, meaning the hammer. Therefore, this is called the Maccabean Revolt. A large number of these original patriots died in the first engagement with the king's troops, again, because they refused to fight on the Sabbath. But revising their policy after this tragic slaughter, they decided they would fight even on the Sabbath if compelled to do so. Then they engaged in vigorous attacks on all of their fellow Jews who had bowed to Antiochus's ordinance and forsaken their God. Not long afterward, Mattathias died, whether from illness or wounds, we don't know. But he entrusted the leadership of the Israelite forces to his own capable sons. For the next few years, Judas successfully led an army of Jews against the Syrians. Their brave exploits are described in 2 apocryphal books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. On December 25th, 165 BC, the Jewish patriots cleansed and rededicated the temple Antiochus had defiled, thus completing the 2300 days mentioned in Daniel 8:14. That is from September 6th, 171 BC, the beginning of the desecration, until December 25th, 165 BC. This later became a Jewish holiday known as the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. It is also called the Festival of Lights because of an incident that occurred during the dedication. As the victorious Jews went about rededicating the temple, whoops, I'm a little behind, I guess. This is a drawing of one of Mattathias' sons, Simon. War elephants were a huge advantage, and Antiochus Epiphanes had them, and of course the Jewish soldiers did not. And so this war elephant was creating a lot of havoc upon the Jewish army, and Simon could only see one way of bringing him down because arrows didn't do it. So he got underneath him and stuck a spear right up through his stomach, killed the elephant. But the elephant fell and killed him. A great act of bravery. So during this rededication of the temple, in order to rededicate the temple, they had to light the menorah lamp for 8 days to purify the temple. But in order to do so, they had to have that much oil dedicated to go into the lamps. Unfortunately, they only had 1 day's worth of oil. So what do? You can't create more oil until the temple's dedicated, but you can't dedicate the temple until you've got more oil. It's a conundrum. So what happens? Well, they decided we can only do what we can do. So they put the 1 day's worth of oil in the menorah and lit it, and miraculously it lasted for 8 days. That's why it's called the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication, which is the dedication of the temple. And we're told in the New Testament that Jesus celebrated this holiday as well. And so from that time on, Hanukkah has been celebrated with 9 branch menorahs, or lampstands. There were questions concerning proper procedure for which they had no answers, and their decision was to delay those matters, as we're told in 1 Maccabees 4:46, until there should come a prophet to show what should be done with them. So they're waiting for that prophet. In 163 BC, Antiochus IV died insane in Persia. And the prophecies of Daniel 11 were fulfilled. There's a run through of all the people, interesting people that we are not talking about, but are mentioned or prophesied in Daniel 11. Well, the cause of freedom was maintained through the vicissitudes of defeat and success till finally a strong Jewish kingdom was founded by John Hyrcanus, one of the descendants. If we went back to the family line, we see he is a grandson of Mattathias and the son of Simon Maccabeus, and enlarged to its fullest extent by his warlike son Alexander Jannaeus. So you can see they eventually became quite a large kingdom. The Hasmonean family thus ruled in Israel from around 143 to 63 BC. But in 67 BC, civil war broke out between two brothers. And one of them, well, let's see. Yeah, we'll pass by him. Well, we need to. Oh, before we do the Civil War, there was one of the Hasmonean rulers was John Hyrcanus, and he did something that's important for what's going to happen later. He expanded the kingdom even further, including Transjordan. That means across the Jordan, so east of the Jordan. Idumea, which is south. You can see it on the map there in blue, and Samaria. The important thing he did was he started a policy of forced conversions, including the Edomites, who were the ones living in Idumea. They had come over to that area from Edom, and he forced them to convert to Judaism. Well, what happens when you force people to convert? How sincere are they? How dedicated are they? No. Yeah, so that's going to create issues. During this time, we have two Jewish parties come on the scene. The Hasidim, which are called the pious ones, they were the ones that were defending the scriptures, and they eventually become the Pharisees. The Hellenists, those who were accepting Greek influence, later become the Sadducees. And we find that even in the time of Jesus. The Pharisees are the ones that believe in the scriptures. The Sadducees are willing to accept Greek ideas. They don't really accept all the scriptures as being God's word. And this is where it originates, is during the War of the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty. And then the Essenes come on into play here as well, as they rejected the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees weren't strict enough. And so the Essenes went off to live by themselves. So this is largely the area of the Hasmoneans. Okay, we can see several people involved there that were descendants. And there are the actual photographs. They had a photograph session each time somebody came on the throne, and that goes through the different rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty. You can see one of them is Salome Alexandra. She was a piece of work. You ought to read about her. And they use the same name over and over again: Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Antigonus. See, we have Alexander Jannaeus, was a brother who came on the throne and expanded the territory of Judea, almost equal to Solomon's kingdom. There's another map of the conquests. There's Salome Alexander, or Alexandra. And this was an interesting time because her husband was pro-Sadducee, but her brother was a Pharisee, and her husband killed her brother. And then when her husband died, she took over and brought the Pharisees back in. And it's just fascinating stuff. So she had two sons, Hyrcanus II, who was pro-Pharisee, and Aristobulus, who was pro-Sadducee. When she died, they entered into a civil war as to who would be the ruler. John Hyrcanus II came out on top because he had some help from an Idumean who, his family had been forced to become Jews, and he saw an opportunity. He came up from Idumea, told John Hyrcanus what to do in order to gain victory, and part of that was to allow the Roman general Pompey, who was in the area looking for places to conquer for Rome, to come and settle the dispute. And so Pompey chose Hyrcanus, and he became the next ruler. Here, a couple coins have been found of his. And even though he was pro-Pharisee, he still has Greek stuff on his coins. So this is a look at the overall picture of the area of the Jewish people. We had the Persians dominating, then the Greeks come in. The Jews have an independent state after the Maccabean revolt, and then the Romans have some quasi-control, sort of advisory, and then eventually the Romans take over around 37 BC. Here's another look at the time frame. The Old Testament completed in 400 BC. Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire 331, and in 167, under one of Alexander's, the descendants of one of his generals, there's a Maccabean rebellion, is initiating the rule of the Hasmonean kings, and then Rome comes in, and Rome is in charge when we get to the birth of Jesus. But one of the reasons why it's so important what occurred here is this man Antipater, technically Antipater II, who came and helped John Hyrcanus. He really became the power behind the throne. John Hyrcanus was not a good ruler. Antipater II ruled for him. And Antipater II had a son whose name was Herod. Antipater II eventually gained more and more power, taking over other parts of what we might call Israel today, and appointed one of his sons, Phaziel, as the king over Jerusalem, another of his sons, Herod, as king over Galilee. And after having accomplished that and feeling like he was really in the driver's seat, he died. Some say he was poisoned. So then came the question of who's going to rule over this area. And of course, Rome now takes more and more charge of the area, and they decide that Herod would be in charge. Oh, I'm sorry, before that, I skipped something very important. When Phaziel was king over Jerusalem, and here we see the history of the Herods, and here we see Phaziel over Jerusalem, Herod over Galilee. A group of people called the Parthians invaded. The Parthians are what was left of the old Persian Empire. Let's see if I can go ahead here. And all this has to do with Julius Caesar. We won't get into all that. Pompey did some bad things, entering the Holy of Holies. There was civil war in the empire following the death of Julius Caesar. There's the assassination of Caesar. The Hasmoneans, as it takes us down to the time of Caesar. There's Aristobulus. Okay, we kind of skip over him. He also forced conversions. Alexander Jannaeus. During Jannaeus's rule, a lot of Jews fled Israel because he was so bad. They fled to Egypt. So there was a large contingent of Jewish people living in Egypt after that time. It became commonplace. In fact, so commonplace that Alexander Jannaeus had the priests declare anyone who left Israel was unclean. Okay, we talked about her. Get to the Civil War. Sorry, I intended to go through all of this, but We don't need to. All right, so in the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar, Antipater II was poisoned. Herod avenged his father, took care of the unrest that was occurring, and was appointed governor. And his father, or his brother, was governor over Jerusalem. Those two. Now let's talk about Herod for a second. He was a very good administrator. He removed all the robbers out of Galilee. And but then the Parthian Empire came into play. You see the Parthian Empire there in the middle in purple? You can see that they're right up against the Roman Empire. So what happens when you got two empires right next to each other? They fight. And so there was a lot of fighting between the two, although the Parthian Empire was not as great as the Roman, not as mighty, but they still had a lot of difficulties. Here's another look at the Parthian Empire closer up. You can see it covers a pretty wide area, similar to what the Persian Empire had occupied. If you know any of the names of cities of the Persian Empire, you can see them on there. There's Susa, Babylon, down towards the bottom, Persepolis, and there it is in comparison to the other lands around to the greatest extent. All right, so Herod has established himself in Galilee, but there's still a Hasmonean around. One of the Hasmonean descendants has been, as punishment to his father, was sent to Rome, and he was trained in Rome. But when things opened back up in Jerusalem, he saw an opportunity to come to Jerusalem and to take over for the family once again. Well, when he got there, he found that there was another group of people that were attacking Jerusalem, and these were the Parthians. They had come in from the east and established or took out Phasael, defeated Phasael, and put Antigonus on the throne of Jerusalem. At this time, Herod felt that he was in danger of his life from the Parthians, and so he fled to Masada. You guys been to Masada, right? Yeah, that's when Herod first became acquainted with it, I think. It was a fortress built on top of a tabletop mountain. Antigonus attempted to kill Herod, but he and his family fled to Masada, which is back here. You can see it's located right beside the Dead Sea. Herod crossed the Dead Sea and continued to Petra. You guys been to Petra? Yeah, fantastic place. At that time, it was wealthy from trade, and wealth comes power. And so the king of the Arabs was in charge there, and Herod went to him for help against the Parthians, but he refused. And so Herod continued on to Alexandria, Egypt, and then went on to Rome. And when he arrived at Rome, they gave him great honors. They welcomed him. Well, here's Masada. Here's what it looks like, where he left his family. He would later build this part down in the lower right hand. Here's what it looks like today. Do you see that little bit of blue out there in the distance? You see that little strip of blue just below the flag? That's the Dead Sea. Everything from Masada to the Dead Sea, nothing grows there. It is totally desolate. All the minerals from the Dead Sea just filter in the air to that. Here's a picture of a fantastic structure in Petra, carved into the side of a mountain. Amazing. People hung down, and it was actually built from the top down, as people would hang down on scaffolds and stuff and by hand carve these things. Amazing. It had been on a trade route camel caravans gone through there. This is what's left of a statue of, see if you can pick it out, a man in the front leading a camel. So there are two sets of feet of the camel left. This is along a waterway, what you call it, that brings water into Petra, a very dry place, but there's water outside, and this water is a water spout. It brings the water in to the city. See both of those. Here's walking into the city of Petra. Just enormous walls on both sides, very beautiful. Yes. And somehow, all day long, never casts a shadow. I swear the sun must have gone right along as it was going through the sky, because when we went in, there were no shadows when we came out. We were looking for a shadow now and again to get under, because it was 120 degrees. And it was not in Petra. Yeah, we rode horses on the way out because we were walking and it was so hot. And Beth said, I don't care how much it costs. We're riding the rest of the way. We've had a boy with a couple of horses. But that's where Herod went for help. You go down this walkway with high walls on either side. And then you break out, and this is what you see. That structure that was called, when it was discovered in the 1800s, I think it was, by a Frenchman, they thought it looked so grand, they thought it must be a treasury. So it's called the treasury, but it's not really. It was a tomb. And there's another tomb, I believe. Street of Facades. And that's more where they lived, I believe, in these caves, not in those nice structures. Few flowers growing there. That's on the inside. That line going across there is the line between the wall and the ceiling. And that was not painted by anybody. That's the actual color of the rock. And they're all like that all over. Just beautiful. It's outside once again. And I tell you, we were exhausted by the end of that day. Oh yeah, because the rock is very red. There's some of the steps. Okay, so now we come back to the Parthian Empire. The Parthians, they're the Parthians. They're descendants of the Persians in a way. They perpetuated a lot of the same customs of the Persians. And so these Parthians came in, took over Jerusalem, captured Phaziel, drove out Herod. And in Rome, Octavian and Mark Antony persuaded the Senate to appoint Herod king of the Jews. So remember, is he a descendant of David? No. His father was an Edomite. So Herod is an Edomite, but he's king of the Jews. Well, they basically are the Persian Empire, a little bit smaller. Mark Antony persuaded the Senate to appoint Herod king of the Jews. This is when Mark Antony and Octavian were co-rulers of the empire after the death of Julius Caesar. Octavian later would become Caesar Augustus after he defeats Antony and Cleopatra. And so they gave armies to Herod to go back and reclaim the kingdom from the Parthians. And so he became the undisputed ruler of Judea. During the Roman Civil War between Antony and Caesar, Herod switched allegiance from, to Octavius from Antony. His dad was the same way. He was able to figure out who's going to be on top and would switch allegiance from the future loser to the future winner. Seemed to always know who that would be. His land holdings increased, and he suppressed Pharisees and executed Sadducees. There was a period of prosperity as Herod acquired land and engineered a big building program. That's really where he gets the name the Great, is from his building programs. He built a royal palace and fortress in 24 BC. And including these towers in Jerusalem. His fortress called the Herodian, just outside of Jerusalem, which is, well, it was on this hill, mountain peak. It's no longer there. And he began building the temple in 29 BC. This is a model showing what it would have looked like at the time of Jesus from one angle. And there it is from another angle. You can see the very back, the very tall part is the Holy of Holies, or the holy place. Inside would be the Holy of Holies. The area in front is the outer court. On one side, I think it's the right, is the court of the Gentiles. On the left, the court of the women. You can see why the disciples were pretty impressed by this structure. Why they said to Jesus, "Look at this, how great this is." And these stones, I mean, they look kind of small here, but they're really huge stones. They weigh several ton each. He also built the city of Caesarea Maritima, usually called just Caesarea, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. He wanted to have a great seaport for Judea. He wanted to rival Alexandria. And so he built this city largely out of marble, which also included dredging part of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea there, to make a harbor. And it was used by the Romans as their capital in Judea. So the capital for Rome in Judea was not Jerusalem, it was Caesarea. That's why I remember when Paul was taken captive by the Romans because of the riot that ensued with him being in Jerusalem, they took him to Caesarea for trial. There's a sign at Caesarea telling about the city and Herod building it and it becoming the seat of the Roman governors. And then later on, Crusaders came in and Muslims came in, and so on. And there was what was the harbor of Caesarea. In Caesarea, of course, he built a hippodrome. What's a hippodrome? I'll give you a hint. There are races that take place there. What races in a hippodrome? Horses, because the word hippo means horse. Hippopotamus means river horse. So horses. Hippos are horses, so it's a hippodrome. And that's where they raced around, chariot races. See an overview there. There's a racing chariot. Whoops, that tells about it, but don't have a picture of it. And there it is from another angle, hippodrome. It's interesting to go to the Caesarea. There are a lot of baths there. Romans liked their baths. Herod did too. He tried to be Roman. Where that green grass was once the harbor. There's the outer wall. And there's an aqueduct built by Herod outside of Caesarea. Aqueduct, aqua, water. It brings water into the city. And this was a Roman invention that Herod used as well. And this is still there. A lot of aqueducts are not there anymore. And it was really big, isn't it? I don't have a picture on here, but I have another one of me standing underneath it, and you couldn't reach up the top of the arch. I was standing on a stone and I still couldn't reach up. Amazing structures. Yeah, Caesarea was a pretty good place. Yeah. And I just outside of Caesarea, when we were coming out of the ruins there, I spotted an aloe vera plant. Oh, I should call it a tree. It was probably, I don't know, 20 feet high, at least. And there was a member of our group who was having problems with her skin. I noticed she always had long sleeves on, even though it was really hot. And she said that ever since she had some kind of an operation, either her kidney or something, that she became sensitive to the sun and would get sun poisoning. So it would get really itchy. So she always wore long sleeves. I said, well, let me suggest something. So I went over to this aloe vera tree and broke off a hunk of it. I said, rub some of this on your arms and see if that doesn't help the itching. And she didn't do it right then. I thought, okay, well, just one more crazy person telling you what to do. But the next day she came and said, I put some of that on my arms before I went to bed last night. And she said, it's wonderful. It worked greatly. So aloe vera, it's good for your skin. All right, let's get back to Herod the Great. You can see Herod the Great's kingdom there. He kept expanding his kingdom. His sons ended up inheriting a lot of that as well. Let's see if we can. His sons were sent to the best schools in Rome, and he married. See where the arrow is? He married a young lady named Mariamne, or Miriam, who was in the Hasmonean line. He thought that by marrying her, the Jewish people would accept him as king, because the Hasmoneans were kind of considered royalty, although they were not descendants of David. So that's why he married Mariamne. He and the Romans drove the Parthians out, but his brother Phaziel died on the way back to Parthia. Some think he committed suicide, but Herod always blamed the Parthians for what had happened to his brother Phaziel. So now you know a little bit of something of where Herod came from. Let's look at his character a little bit, if you don't mind, a few more minutes here. He had a number of wives. He had a wife named Doris, and he finally sent her away after 10 years of marriage, called her back, sent her away again. She's a mother of Antipater. The Hasmonean princess Mariamne married her, and then when he sent Doris away, executed her in 29 or 28. According to Josephus, he was passionately devoted to her. If there were any of his wives that he loved, it was her, but she hated him just as passionately. She gave him 5 children, and he killed her because he suspected that she was plotting against him. Also killed her mother, which would be his mother-in-law, and her brother, who was the chief priest at the time. Also killed 2 of those sons because he was afraid they would try to take over the kingdom. He married an unknown niece, an unknown cousin, the daughter of a Jerusalem priest who was Mariamne II. They had a son named Herod, a Sumerian woman named Malthace. Their children were Antipas, Archelaus, and Olympias. A Jerusalem woman named Cleopatra. They had 2 sons, Herod and Philip. So notice he's got 2 sons named Herod. It's really confusing. He married Pallas. They had a son named Phaziel, named after his departed brother, and another wife named Phaedra, who had a daughter named Roxanne. So you thought Henry VIII was bad. Well, Herod could show him a thing or two. Oh, not to mention Elpis. They had a daughter named Salome. No. Now, the Cleopatra that you know was a Greek actually ruling Egypt and she became romantically involved with Julius Caesar, had a son by him. And then when Caesar and Mark Antony went to war, Mark Antony fled to Egypt, became acquainted with Cleopatra, and they developed a relationship. I think she had twins by him. And then she joined Mark Antony in fighting against Julius Caesar, and they were defeated at the naval battle, and they went back to Egypt, where Mark Antony was, which way it was. Mark Antony was told that Cleopatra killed herself, so he stabbed himself with a knife. Cleopatra heard, she went to him, it was too late, he died, and so she arranged for somebody to bring her a poisonous snake to bite her, and she died, so she committed suicide. So different, a lot of people at that time named Cleopatra. This one's from Jerusalem. All right, King Herod the Great. He killed his son Aristobulus III. He killed Uncle Joseph because he accused Uncle Joseph of having an affair with Mariamne. He killed his son. I'm sorry, he killed not his son, but Hyrcanus II, who had been high priest before. He killed 45 members of the Sanhedrin. Killed Mariamne, his wife, Alexandra, his sons through Mariamne. He killed 300 soldiers, and he killed Antipater. So he killed a lot of people. In fact, he killed so many people in his own family, his own sons, that Caesar Augustus said this: "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." Herod wouldn't kill a pig because he's trying to be Jewish. Caesar Augustus is using a play on words in Greek. He said, "I would rather be Herod's hus than his huios." All right, so that tells us the background of who Herod is. You know a little more about him maybe than you did before, and maybe understand a little bit of what's happening here in Matthew chapter 2, but we still don't know who are the Magi. Where did they come from? Who are they? What are they doing in Jerusalem? And what is it about them that scares Herod so much that he's so disturbed that all Jerusalem is disturbed with him? We'll find out next week. How many times did you ride a camel? Oh, I wish I'd have quit at one. It was terrible. Yeah.
Now, when the pastor or